What is up guys, Paddy here from Triage, and today we are going to discuss the controversies around low volume versus high volume training approaches. And by this I mean how many sets you do, because that is generally the crux of the argument here. Should you be doing a lower number of sets or should you be doing a higher number of sets? And the reality of the situation is it kind of doesn't matter. Like, yes, it does matter and we'll get into it, but across your training life, across your training career, you're probably going to go through periods of lower training volume, periods of higher training volume, and that's perfectly fine. You know, you shouldn't be married to one system. Rather, you should focus on the overall principles, the overall understanding of resistance training, so that you can actually modify your training program to get the results that you want. And with that in mind, you do see a lot of arguments. You see a lot of people advocate for a lower volume approach. A lot of people advocate for a higher volume approach. You see a lot of like pro bodybuilders who used a lower volume approach, got great results. You see a lot of bodybuilders that used high volume training and got great results. So who's actually right? And as we kind of alluded to there, both of them are kind of right? First of all, different people respond differently to different stimulus. Someone might find that they actually respond a little bit better to a lower volume approach, while someone else finds that they respond a little bit better to a higher volume approach. And that is unfortunately just what we have to deal with when we're talking about stuff like training program design, because you are going to have to come up with an understanding, or rather you're going to have to build an understanding of your body, how you respond to training, how you respond to the diet, etc. Right? Which makes it very confusing and very hard to actually get a clear answer, because you can always kind of just wave your hands and say, yeah, like there's inter-individual responses, so you know everything works. But that doesn't really help you understand how you should structure your training program. So we'll give you a kind of framework for thinking about this. In general, the research does seem to suggest that somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week seems to be a good place to be for muscle building. Right? So if that's the case, we now just have to think, okay, I'm going to talk about my chest, my back, my quads, my hamstrings, glutes, calves, biceps, triceps, etc. Right? You can break it down by body part. Now, there is obviously some crossover, like you train your back, you're training your biceps a little bit. So how do you actually count the volume there for biceps? But forgetting about all those little minor things, we kind of know, and it seems to be the case, that somewhere in the region of 10 to 20 sets per body part per week seems to make sense for muscle building. Right, cool. We can use that as the framework. So when we're talking about, oh, should you do a lower volume, higher volume, etc., you probably want to stay somewhere in that region, right? Whether it's you prefer to stay closer to the bottom range, you're like doing 10 sets, or you prefer to stay closer to the top range, you're doing 20 sets. That's probably the sweet spot. Now, there is potential benefit for more sets above and beyond that, but then you really have to look at the overall program structure, and you have to ensure that, you know, if you're training, I don't know, quads, for example, for 30 sets, you have to make sure that you're not trying to train your chest, your back, your biceps, everything else for 30 sets as well. You're going to have to take into account more systemic fatigue as a result, right? So anyway, 10 to 20 sets. Now, if you look at, you know, big bodybuilders that use the low volume, high volume approach, they generally seem to fall within that. Now, some of them, again, they go higher, some of them go lower, but generally they do seem to fall somewhere in that region across the week, right? Now, you might say, oh, but what about X bodybuilder or Y bodybuilder? They did this. So is that breaking this rule? No, first of all, it's kind of a soft rule. You know, you might be able to get away with a little bit less. You might be able to get away with a little bit more, but that doesn't mean that that's the case for everyone. And oftentimes, especially on the low volume approach, you see people say, oh, I do a very low volume approach. I do 1 set per body part, you know, or not per body part, rather 1 set per exercise, and maybe I do 3 exercises. But very often you also see them doing a lot of warm-up sets, a lot of hard warm-up sets as well, which other people might just actually count as sets. They might just be like, that's part of your training approach. You've just kind of ramped up the intensity, right? So we have to take that into account. The waters get very muddied with all this stuff. But anyway, 10 to 20 sets per body part per week seems to be a good place to be. Generally, we probably want to stay in the region of 3 to 10 sets per body part per workout. So if we're doing 20 sets per week, that's probably going to mean that we're going to need to train that body part twice per week, maybe even more. So that helps you understand the frequency aspect. If you want to train 4 times per week and you're like, I have to get 20 sets for my quads, 20 sets for my hamstrings, 20 sets for my chest, my back, whatever. Again, you're going to have to be really focused on how you actually space those sets out across the week to make sure that it is a coherent, cohesive training plan. Right, so 3 to 10 sets per body part per workout. If you do a lower amount of sets, whether it's in a given workout or it's in a given week, those sets can probably be closer to failure. In general, we're probably aiming to stay roughly 2 to 3 reps shy of complete failure, right? That seems to be the sweet spot where you get some good muscle building, but you're not getting excessive fatigue and soreness from those workouts, and you're still getting a lot of effective reps. However, if you are training with a very low volume approach, you probably can get a little bit closer to failure, maybe 1 to 2 reps in reserve, because you're doing a lower volume overall, and as a result, you're actually getting less effective reps. If you do 3 effective reps per set and you only do 1 set versus the other individual that does 4 sets, of course, they're getting way more of a training stimulus because they're simply doing more effective reps, right? So if you're training with a lower volume, you can probably get away with training a little bit closer to failure, perhaps even beyond failure a little bit with, the assistance of spotters, negative reps, eccentrically overloaded reps, that kind of thing. However, it does still come at a cost, right? And on top of that, if you are training with a higher training volume, you probably need to stay a little bit further away from failure, because you can't do 20 sets to failure. It's just not possible. Yes, you could, but you're going to see this huge drop off in performance across a workout and probably across the week in general, right? So we have to kind of play off whether we're doing a lower volume approach and taking it a little bit closer to failure versus a higher volume approach where we're maybe keeping a few more reps in reserve, all right? And this really kind of gets to the crux of the issue, because a lot of people, it's not actually the lower or higher volume approaches that they're discussing. What they're really talking about is the fact that they like to train closer to failure, or they like to train a little bit further away from failure. And that then dictates what kind of volume they're able to tolerate and what kind of volume they need to get an effective stimulus. And neither of them is necessarily right or wrong. They're simply tools in the toolbox, and we can use different tools for different jobs, and we can use different tools across our lifespan. We're not pigeoned into a certain, I can only train in this way because I'm known as the low volume guy or whatever. We need to make sure that we are thinking about this more coherently, more cohesively, right? We need to think of it in terms of what is the return on investment that I'm getting. Because you might say, oh, well, I actually do like training closer to failure, so I'm going to do a lower volume approach. However, that might not actually be appropriate for you, given that your stress is very high, you want to train 6 days per week, all these other factors as well have to be taken into account, right? You need to make sure that you're understanding the return on investment for what you're putting in. And what we generally recommend our clients do is to start at a lower volume approach. And that doesn't necessarily mean the very bottom end. We're not saying, oh, you only need to do 9 sets per week and we're not going to add any sets until you've got that perfected. That's not necessarily the case, but we're probably going to choose a lower volume approach to start, let's say maybe 12 sets per body part across the week, right? And the reason we're doing that is because we want to milk that 12 sets for all it's worth, right? We want to ensure that we're able to train really effectively for those 12 sets and really get as much as possible from that, so that we know if we were to add more sets to the workout or to the training plan overall, that we would still be actually getting a positive return on investment. Because if you go from doing 3 sets for an exercise and bumping it up to 4 sets for an exercise, you're getting a pretty big 33% increase in your overall training volume just for that exercise. So That's a very, potentially positive return on investment. However, if you go from 4 sets to 5 sets, that's only a 25% increase in training volume. So you're at 125%, right? So there is a drop off in terms of the return on investment purely by virtue of you're already doing more volume. So the increases are smaller relatively, but also the results you get from that are not linear. In terms of doing more volume doesn't necessarily mean getting more muscle. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is be as efficient with our muscle building as possible. There's probably a sweet spot in terms of how much training volume you need to do to get the results that you want. And while you might enjoy training, that doesn't necessarily mean that you should always be at the higher end of that training volume, the higher end of the investment, time, energy, whatever, into training. You can do lower volume approaches, maybe to be more time efficient, although oftentimes, again, because you'll lift a little bit heavier, you'll go closer to failure, you have to take longer rest periods as a result, so it's not necessarily, shorter amount of time in the gym, but regardless of all that, you might find that certain times, certain goals you have, maybe you want to build more strength specific to a certain rep range or whatever, and you find lower volume approaches allow you to be really focused for 1 to 2 sets rather than being a little less focused when you're doing 4 to 5 sets or whatever it is, right? There's a variety of reasons why we might use a lower or higher volume approach. But again, I want you to think of them as purely tools in the toolbox rather than being your entire paradigm, your entire approach. If you were to really dial into it and go, which is going to result in better results, it's impossible to actually tell. However, using best practices and the best evidence that we have available to us, we're probably going to suggest doing between 10 to 20 sets per body part per week, with somewhere in the region of 3 to 10 sets per workout per body part, and spacing them out across the week to maximize recovery. And as a result of that, we can say you're probably more likely to build muscle. However, you as an individual may find certain levels of volume, you do better, you respond better to it. You might find lower volume suits your mentality, your physiology, your psychology a lot better than higher volume, and vice versa. And that's okay. So any of these discussions you see online of, oh, well, I follow this approach, so it must be the best approach. Again, you can look at that and go, that's probably not someone who has trained a lot of people. That's probably not someone who has really, had to deal with changes in training across a life cycle, across their lifespan. I've been Paddy from Triage, and if you do have any questions, comments, whatever, and you want to get in touch with us, you can leave a comment below. Other than that, I really do hope you enjoyed the video. If you did enjoy the video, if you could like, comment, subscribe, do all of those things. It really does help the channel. It really does help us get these videos out to the people that want to actually learn this information and want to actually, develop their knowledge. Anyway, guys, we will see you in the next one.